I welcome you all. We are very proud that the OECD chose our school to be the place to present and discuss their economic survey of Israel. This is the second time in a row that we host the OECD mission. This year, we will mark the 10th anniversary of our school that is committed both to excellence in research as any other department in the university, but also committed to advancing the vision of making the public sector more efficient and responsive to the benefit of the Israeli society. The productive discussion we will have today is just another way to advance the vision of our school. So without further ado, I would like to invite the president of Hebrew University, Professor Mנחem ben Sasson, to say a few words of welcoming. Please.
Dr. Dahan, dear guests, members of the school, we are honored and happy that the first report that all Israel was getting up this morning to look at, and that's the mirror of, who knows, the queen or the daughter of the queen, but it is a picture of ourselves, to read what we read. We wanted to be part of this family of nations for many years. Many of us, of this school, I wasn't a member of this school in these years, read about it, wrote papers about it, were involved in the day-to-day work of the government and of the legislative body in order to reach to this point. It wasn't easy. One of them, nowadays one of us, is Dr. Yaron Mariav, whom I remember to be the Lord Protector of the process in the Knesset. At that time he was the Director General of the Ministry of Finance. It's not an easy job. We were accepted. Being accepted is not only to have a merit that you go with a label, we are part of the OECD. From time to time you get a report card. And we are very happy to read this report. Everybody takes pages, so I would take the pages about education and competitive grants. I would take the pages about balancing a budget, what is the power of it. Each and every student in this institute knows how important it is and how difficult is it to reach, because it's not to read about, but to make. It's like a juggler work. They are the ones who are going to do it in no time. You are the ones to come again and to show to us whether the education you gave was the report that you prepared justifying the education. It's a triangle. It starts here. It goes to the other part of the town, namely next to the other campus, to the hill, in order to make the legislation and the executive to make the decisions. And then it is for you to come in again and again to compare and to put a mirror again to say, you are successful or no. We know. That's the way we work. Not every politician would love to have it, but it is an essential part of our education. It is only one report of OECD. There are many, many other aspects. I don't want to go to the classes that you give on these reports or these chapters of legislation and commitment. It is needed for a sober country and for a very responsible institute in this city and this country to follow in the years to come. So we commit ourselves to be part of the process. We expect you to come again and to show us what have we got to do in the future. And it's more than just a commitment. It's part of the schedule, part of the curriculum. And that's the way we see yourselves, students, as leaders of tomorrow, being responsible to what you learn today in both ways. Thank you very much.
I would like to invite the Dean of Social Sciences Faculty, Professor Aבנר שליט, please.
Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome. The fact that the OECD chooses this school for presenting its report is really flattering, and I regard it as a compliment, and I would like to thank Momi and everybody in the school, the academic and administrative staff, for organizing this event. The President has just said how much Israel was eager to join the OECD, and how the OECD and how being a member of the OECD implies certain obligations in terms of economic policies and regulations. I cannot escape saying something which goes beyond the economy. It seems to me that being a member of the OECD implies also some moral obligations. And Israel now is witnessing an exclusion of women from public policy, from public space in many areas, and by many groups and firms and municipalities. And there is a strong and fierce debate about it in Israel. And I really wish and hope that our leaders will agree with us, I hope, that being a member of the OECD implies not only economic obligations that will be discussed today by you and Sharon Gilad and Claude Barabi, but also some moral duties, and that it implies being civilized in a broad sense. Thank you for coming, and I hope to enjoy your talk.
What we will have now is a presentation of about 35 minutes by Peter and Philip, Peter Jarrett, Dr. Peter Jarrett and Dr. Philip Hemmings. And after that, Dr. Claude Barabi and Dr. Sharon Gilad will discuss their report. So please.
So following up on that, I guess I could say that one of the key words when there is a discussion of a new member country to the OECD is like-mindedness. And so I could only say that, speaking personally, I support very much the Dean's choice of that particular aspect as being one that's crucial to like-mindedness. It's a very great pleasure for Phil and me to be here this evening for this presentation and discussion. No doubt few of you know that we already spoke to a similar audience 2 years ago on the occasion of the release of the first OECD economic survey of Israel when you were not yet members. The latest survey was made public yesterday, and we look forward to hearing your views on the policy advice that our member countries have authorized us to transmit to your government. The areas that we are covering in this survey are macroeconomic and financial sector policies, energy and environment, and the housing market. Now, I will make the first part of the presentation and Phil will follow up. No, sorry. Oh, now I've done it. Got to go all the way back through. Sorry. Went the wrong way. Okay. Yeah. Let me begin by situating Israel's growth performance in recent years. In the mid-2000s, Israel's economic growth began to systematically exceed those of the OECD and to at least match the world total. While you too suffered from the 2008-2009 downturn, year-on-year growth never actually turned negative. And with the 2010-11 recovery, the expansion returned to the near 5% annual pace enjoyed for several years prior to the crisis. Well, I still haven't gotten used to this. Okay. Why did that disappear? This isn't normal either. There, that's better. The healthy pace of recovery from the 2008-9 crisis has been job-rich. The unemployment rate has fallen to the lowest level for many years, and the labor force participation rate has been rising. Israel now enjoys an unemployment rate that is nearly 2.5 percentage points below the OECD average. Nevertheless, participation remains well below the OECD average, about 3.5 percentage points. Let me get this right. I'm still not doing it. I'm going to keep my finger there. Also, our assessment is that Israel's cyclical position is that supply and demand seem to be pretty close to balance. But the news is not all good. It will not surprise anybody that the euro area is leading the world into another period of very slow growth, even if not outright recession. The foreign trade channel is, of course, the primary means by which the global business cycle is transmitted to Israel, and year-on-year growth in exports has weakened considerably, culminating in an outright fall in export volumes year-on-year in the third quarter. Imports have been better maintained, mainly because of the strength of domestic demand, which had shown no signs of easing by the third quarter. Furthermore, Israel's longer-term per capita GDP performance has been rather unexceptional. Even after 8 years or so of catching up, GDP per capita in purchasing power parity terms relative to the top half of OECD countries is now only just back to where it was in the mid-1990s. The shortfall is still around a quarter. It is possible that this latest phase of catch-up will continue, but this does not give grounds for complacency in efforts to improve the macroeconomic and structural policy frameworks. And crucially, on the social side, the fruits of those improved standards of living over the past 8 years have not been shared very evenly, and income distribution has become ever more skewed. More on that later. So if you can read it, these are our latest set of projections that were released about 2 weeks ago, and we've included them in yesterday's survey. We call this a muddling through scenario that assumes that there is no financial catastrophe, and thus the probability of something much worse is fairly high, while there is only a small chance of anything much better. We would term the outcome for Israel something like fair to middling, with 2.9% real output growth projected for 2012 and 3.9% for 2013. This represents substantially better performance than in many other OECD countries, though remember that Israel's relatively rapid population growth partly drives this relatively good outcome. But I think you'll agree that if realized, such an outcome will allow policymakers to breathe a sigh of relief. In a downside scenario, growth could well be several percentage points weaker in both years than in the baseline. In other words, a repeat of 2009 is by no means out of the question. Now let me turn to policy matters. The recent and current conjuncture for monetary policy is, of course, exceptionally difficult. Until recently, policy was attempting to strike a balance between, on the one hand, worries about housing and commodity price increases and the inflationary implications of the rapid pace of recovery in output growth, and on the other hand, concerns about the impact of policy rate increases on the exchange rate and consequently export growth. These considerations led the Bank of Israel to conduct a series of moderate rate increases with a view to returning monetary policy settings to those that existed prior to the 2008-9 crisis, but also combined this with active intervention in the foreign exchange market, which I shall discuss in a moment. In light of the gloomier economic prospects, the softening of the housing and primary commodity markets, and falls in inflation expectations and outcomes, the normalization process has stopped. Indeed, the Bank of Israel cut the policy rate for October and again for December. We expect it to cut further, another 50 basis points by early next year, and then hold it there until the middle of 2013, when about something like 100 basis points of tightening should occur by the end of that year as the economy gets back up to speed. One of the key issues for monetary policy makers in recent years has been the level of the shekel. Consistent with the real performance of the economy, it had been strengthening since the beginning of 2006 and began to surge in 2008. The Bank of Israel then began its intervention policy, which prevented the exchange rate from returning to the lofty heights reached in the early years of the decade. No interventions have been conducted since the summer. But while the authorities used the argument that foreign exchange reserves of around 15% of GDP in early 2008 were a little short of desirable levels, the quasi-doubling that occurred by late 2009 put Israel at the top of the league of comparable countries. Only Switzerland's reserves rose faster and higher because of its safe haven status in these times of extreme risk aversion. The cost of having all these reserves is, of course, that they tend to earn pretty much zero interest rates, while the extra borrowing that they engender in shekels must pay much higher rates, thereby creating a true financial burden for the exchequer. The additional reserves might be costing something near 0.5% of GDP at present. We argue that such interventions should probably have ceased earlier because they risked confusing market participants that the authorities may not have been so single-mindedly focused on inflation. But with foreign monetary policy settings admittedly rather extreme, it was perhaps no surprise that some systematic intervention to restrain the appreciation took place until July. In any case, the general rule should be that intervention is only appropriate to stem the tide of destabilizing capital inflows and not to try to avoid changes in the exchange rate that are justified by improving Israeli fundamentals. Our survey also goes into depth into a number of issues of private sector finance following the experience of the 2008-9 credit crunch and ensuing slowdown. In contrast with a number of other OECD countries where households have proved the most in need of deleveraging, Israeli households have managed to keep debt fairly stable in relation to GDP, even if bank loans for housing have surged, much to the consternation of Governor Fisher. This is in part because they have substantially run down corresponding loans from government. It is business borrowers that have raised their indebtedness, at least until the crisis. That extra supply of credit has been supplied in the form of bonds issued by a variety of kinds of firms and purchased mainly by institutional funds and directly by households. The result is one of the largest corporate bond markets in the OECD, as you can see in the left-hand panel. Our take is that the reforms following the HODEC recommendations go in the right direction, but they may not ensure good performance in the bond market. And we are especially concerned about those issued by the real estate sector, given the real possibility of housing price declines. Turning specifically to the banking sector, we observe that financial excesses were avoided in the run-up to the crisis, thanks to conservative practices and effective supervision. Here you will see a number of risk and capital adequacy indicators that point to a sound position for the industry as a whole up until the end of 2010. Nevertheless, we endorse the Bank of Israel's call for an update of the banking legislation that would give the governor and the supervisor of banks more power to make early interventions to head off threats to banks' stability. And while as economists we believe that securitization is a good thing in principle, We recognize the excesses that it engendered in some OECD countries where it was inadequately regulated. And thus, we would remind the authorities of the need to proceed cautiously and with appropriate safeguards with their liberalization plans. Another issue we tackle is household savings, especially pension savings. Following the 2010 Labor Management Agreement to raise pension contribution rates to 17.5% by 2014, our internal pension models show that Israel will have some of the highest after-tax replacement rates in the OECD, especially for low-income workers, even after recognizing that contributions also cover severance pay. Thus, no further increase in pension savings is warranted. Otherwise, the range of pension products is broad, perhaps excessively so, resulting in a suspicion that many people are making poorly informed choices. Streamlining the products would no doubt be a good idea. Finally, the tax treatment of pension savings deserves another look, as does that of advanced training funds. We feel there is little justification for giving such savings access to preferential rate government bonds, and even more obviously, it is wasteful to continue to provide tax breaks on the mandatory component of pension savings. And tax breaks on tax credits on payouts should also be reconsidered, since they benefit mainly affluent Israelis. We have a number of other pieces of financial sector advice as well. First, the authorities have obviously been right to be concerned to cool off the housing market before prices reached bubble proportions. We endorse all the macroprudential measures they have taken. However, the toolkit has not been exhausted, and if the early signs of cooling are not confirmed in the coming months, we would have no hesitation in recommending that both further tightening and faster land release by the ILA, the Israel Lands Administration. On the other hand, if the correction should look too abrupt, as Governor Fisher, for example, fears, threatening financial stability, then repealing the measures recently taken would likewise be appropriate. Second, while best practice in the design of financial supervisory architecture is still being debated throughout the OECD, it is clear that having a three-agency structure, as in Israel, requires strong coordination. Laudable efforts are being made in that direction in Israel, but they may not prove sufficient. In any case, there are risks of meddling in having the supervision of capital markets, insurance, and savings in the Ministry of Finance, when they could be avoided if the relevant division were moved away. We also support plans to publish a regular financial stability report. Let me now turn to fiscal policy. Israel's public finances have some fairly unique characteristics. Successive governments have not only managed to bring expenditures down from over 60% of GDP in the mid-1980s to below 45% now, nearly wiping out the gap with the OECD average, but they have also cut revenues by at least as much. And nevertheless, gross public debt has been falling almost uninterruptedly in relation to GDP and is now well below OECD outcomes. The government's record of meeting its deficit targets is good, other than in 2008 when it missed modestly for good reason, and then in 2009 and 10 when original targets were raised because of the unforeseen economic weakness. Deficits have come in below target every year since 2003. In other words, government's tax and spending levels seem to have been a stabilizing force in the economy. Yet Israel now stands at a point where there are sharp trade-offs between debt reduction, spending control, and tax reform, all heightened by pressures from the recent tent protests. We strongly support the medium-term goal of reducing debt further to 60% of GDP, a useful milestone, by aiming for a deficit below 1% of GDP by 2014. But a catching-up economy with a great deal of volatility should probably go further in the longer term. what is remarkable about Israel's public spending is that while it is now about the same share of GDP as in the average OECD country, its structure is quite different. The average country allocates about 1% of its GDP to defense, but Israel is an outlier, with military outlays at around 7% of GDP. While we believe that the overarching objective must be to reduce the deficit and resulting debt, we welcome the new spending rule that loosens up a bit on spending over its predecessor. And as I said earlier, we are cognizant that relative poverty is high. Our colleagues have just published some disquieting income distribution numbers last week. There are crying needs for improved infrastructure, and public sector pay may in some cases have been driven to unsustainably low levels. But while a judicious easing of spending limits is defensible, even faster spending rises would seriously endanger the attainment of the debt targets, whose attainment will on their own require difficult budgetary decisions, or what the Bank of Israel calls prioritization. If social spending is to be boosted further as demanded by the tent protests, then either taxes will have to rise or other spending, notably military, will have to shrink. We have done some illustrative arithmetic simulations to show what will happen to the debt if deficit targets are met and the spending rule is honored. Varying the growth rate shows that the 60% debt target should be met somewhere between 2018 and 2021. In these scenarios, stabilizing spending as a share of GDP requires growth of 3% per year. But that growth rate would not suffice to hold revenues constant and reach the deficit target. Some growth rate of something around 3.5% looks like it would be required. The recent political debate seems to have accepted that more tax revenues are acceptable, and a range of measures recommended by the Trachtenberg Committee has just been legislated. Our preliminary assessment is that they will not prove overly harmful to the nation's competitiveness, but it seems likely that unless growth is surprisingly strong in the coming years, revenue-raising measures will prove necessary. Indeed, no doubt many feel that further rises would be appropriate now. Our view is that if direct tax, especially corporate tax, or Social Security contributions were to be further increased, this would risk inflicting more serious economic costs in terms of growth outcomes and might not generate that much extra revenue anyway. We do think, however, that the taxation of housing could be stiffened, especially on capital gains. Greater greening of the tax system could also help. Fuel excise charges could be raised, as could the various charges for car use. What we most fervently counsel against is any calls for widening exemptions to VAT for social reasons, because that is an inefficient way of providing social protection. Indeed, we believe that even at 16% standard rate of VAT, there is room for an upward adjustment in that standard rate. Any unwanted impact on the poor could be dealt with by partially offsetting targeted transfers through an enhanced earned income tax credit, for example, what you call the negative income tax, I think. We have also a number of other things to say about fiscal policy. Because it is so unusual, we have given some thought to the 2-year budget process that you have used since 2009, Minister Steinitz's pet project. It is obviously less resource intensive and yields administrative savings, but it has downsides too. First, it places a heavy demand on revenue and spending projections that are already always of necessity off the mark in traditional annual frameworks. Second, worthwhile reforms may be delayed until a new budget cycle begins, since many of those reforms require accompanying budget changes. Third, the democratic process may be compromised. Our other main suggestion is to support the government in its reform tax treatment of hydrocarbon resources, following the work of the Shishensky Committee earlier this year, and in its wish to establish a sovereign wealth fund. Furthermore, we argue that the sovereign wealth fund should be independently managed, yet directed to invest entirely in foreign assets so as to mitigate Dutch disease. And it should have a low mandated drawdown rate, something like 4 to 5% per year, in line with real returns to capital, would probably be best. This final slide that I'll present has some simulations that give a rough idea on the potential size of such a sovereign wealth fund based on various assumptions about the scale of gas production in the coming years. It also assumes that the drawdown is equal to the real rate of return on the fund, which implies the fund reaches a constant value in real terms once all resources are exploited. If there are no new discoveries, then revenues will be at most about 1% of GDP, and the real value of the fund will reach about 40% of today's GDP. However, because of real GDP growth, the fund and the drawdown from it will eventually begin to decline, as shown in the bottom two panels. Should natural gas prices rise in real terms at, say, 5% per year, and there is an additional discovery of a similar size to the Leviathan field, then revenues could peak at 3% of GDP per year, and the fund would mature to a value of over 180% of GDP. Thus, we feel that the true value of having a fund relative to putting the proceeds into general revenue is in the event of further discoveries which would lead to a greater risk of Dutch disease. Let me now pass the floor to Phil.
Show me where the magic button is.
Page down.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, good evening. The natural gas fields not only have fiscal implications, but also some positive environmental impacts. The prospects of further natural gas fields coming on stream will allow for a cleaner fuel mix in primary energy. In the past, while Israel has had a relatively low energy intensity, the CO2 generated per capita has been quite high, largely due to the significant share of coal and oil burned in electricity generation. The authorities are not just relying on emission reductions from a further shift into natural gas, but have also formulated a strategy for additional GHG reducing measures. The plan is to reduce GHG emissions by 20% from their baseline level by 2020. Now, one important thing to remember is that in Israel, the baseline greenhouse gas emissions will rise quite rapidly compared to other countries, given the likely path of population and GDP increase. As a result, even achieving the target will mean that GHG emissions will still rise. This is not the case for many of the targets being set in other countries. However, when we compare Israel's GHG target on a per capita basis or a per unit of GDP basis, the targets are similar to those in other countries. The greenhouse gas emission plan has been a welcome move, but we do recommend the following: close monitoring of progress in outcomes and implementation measures. The latter comprise a range of energy efficiency measures and plans to increase the share of renewable energy generation to 10%. Currently, only about 1% of electricity is generated by renewables. Second, we suggest greater use of economy-wide measures. In the survey, we suggest that existing excise on primary fuels could be increased to reflect the price of carbon. The survey also discusses energy use in transport. Further infrastructure development and service improvements to public transport are key towards more environmentally friendly transport. Given this, we welcome the initiatives for expanding the rail network and plans to establish transport authorities in major urban centres. As regards charges and taxes on vehicle use, we welcome the introduction of the green credit on the car purchase tax. However, we maintain that the overall level of the tax should be reduced, possibly in combination with increased taxes and charges on car use. One way of increasing the cost of car use is to increase excise on gasoline. While we recognise this is a sensitive issue right now, increases further down the track should not be discounted as a policy option. As shown in this figure, based on international comparison, there is some headroom for increasing excise on fuels. However, as for other countries with high excise, any comprehensive environmental justification has to either assume quite a high price of carbon or to include other externalities, such as those arising from noise or congestion. Also, the tax treatment on company cars requires attention. As you may know, a substantial share of cars on the road are provided by companies, largely thanks to generous tax incentives. Those provided with these cars have little incentive to switch to public transport or drive in an economical way. Now I'll move on to the structural reform agenda, and Peter's shown you these pictures already. So, as to repeat, there's no strong evidence of sustained catch-up in GDP per capita, although events since the early 2000s are perhaps encouraging, and also no strong signs of abatement in relative poverty. Now, our previous survey looked at the education system, and it underscored the poor scores in international tests, such as the PISA scores, and it also underscored the fact that these poor scores are not confined to certain groups in society. There are general issues of low PISA scores throughout the compulsory education system. The report also underscored the difficult situation regarding policy towards ultra-orthodox education, and it also discussed the difficulties at the time being made in making progress in tertiary education reform. What about progress since then? Well, a deal has been struck with the teaching union for upper secondary school teachers in exchange for increased pay in exchange for increasing hours and reforms to teaching methods, similar to the New Horizon programme deal that was struck for lower secondary school teachers. Second, there has been reform on other fronts, including reductions in class sizes and lengthening compulsory education by 2 years. However, progress in encouraging and persuading ultra-orthodox schools to include more work-oriented skills in their curricula is proving difficult. However, to end on a more positive note, the tertiary sector appears to be moving in terms of reform, and we understand that a proposal is being making some progress right now, including reform of the state's role in funding universities and colleges. However, when we look at employment and social policies, which we also looked at in depth in the 2010 survey, we see rather more mixed progress. The good news is that the earned income tax credit has now become nationwide, and following the Trachtenberg Committee, there is going to be a substantial increase in the value of the credit for single mothers. We would argue that perhaps these increases should have been given to other groups in the population as well. Rather more disappointing news is that the Wisconsin program that used private placement companies to help the unemployed into jobs has been abandoned. Although the scheme was not without fault, the approach has proved successful in other countries. Also, general income support remains meagre, and as far as we are aware, there has been no moves to widen eligibility. For example, by removing the condition that beneficiaries do not have access to a car. And in addition, further increases in the minimum wage have been agreed. The ratio of the minimum wage to the average or median wage remains relatively high in international comparison. We maintain that it would be better to allow the ratio to fall somewhat while increasing the enforcement of the minimum wage. Indeed, from what we can tell, enforcement of labour regulations in general has not been significantly improved since the previous review. In addition, we see some room for improvement in housing support. The most distinctive feature of Israeli housing support is that there are rather complex policy goals. In addition to support for the general population, a significant share of spending goes towards helping recent immigrants. Indeed, in 2009, 51% of central government housing support went to this group. Also, there is a strong element of regional policies. Some schemes are more generous to households in the peripheral areas. Third, Special consideration is also given those to have completed military service, reflecting a wider range of benefits designed to encourage and motivate service, but which also effectively means differential treatment of Jewish and Arab communities. Israeli housing support is also unusually centralised. All support schemes are managed by central government. Elsewhere, municipal governments also play a role. For instance, the development and allocation of public housing is often municipally controlled. While housing support in Israel is in some ways different from that in other countries, it faces some common challenges. In particular, unwanted diversion of support to property developers and existing householders. In Israel, for instance, research has shown that the mortgage subsidies introduced in the mid-1990s contributed to house price increases. In other words, part of the money in fact went to the property developers and existing householders. We hope that the recently announced scheme of mortgage support in 28 localities will not suffer from this problem. Second, mobility traps. For instance, recent OECD work has underscored links between public housing and weak geographic mobility. Low rents in public housing may dissuade unemployed households from moving to where jobs are more plentiful. Third, coherence with other welfare benefits in the tax system. Public housing and rent and mortgage support only partially determine households' financial circumstances and the decisions they make. Getting the overall incentives right is extremely important. We recommend that in broad terms, Israel should aim for a simpler and more transparent system of support. In addition, we suggest some technical changes to support. Universal access to rent support for recent immigrants is probably not a very efficient way of spending public funds, and there should be some form of income or means test, as there is for the general population. Second, we point out that the main mortgage support scheme has absolutely no income criteria whatsoever. It relies solely on a point system. Third, we note that the point system includes points for the numbers of siblings that the applicants have. This is extremely unusual, and we don't think it does a particularly good job at helping focus on households in need. There are some other dimensions of housing policy that we looked at in the survey. First, taxes and charges relating to housing. Transactions taxes and charges are light in Israel compared with other countries. This is a good thing. While these taxes can reduce volatility in housing prices, they are otherwise more distorting than other taxes. As regards taxation during ownership, Israel is also doing quite a good job. It strikes a reasonable compromise. Imputed rents are not added to taxable income, but at the same time, mortgage interest cannot be deducted. However, there are quite generous tax exemptions on capital gains. In particular, tax exemptions on investment property if it is held for a certain number of years. We therefore welcome the recent efforts to reduce these exemptions. The minimum holding period, I think, has been extended from 4 to 8 years. In addition, the chapter notes that Israel, somewhat unusually, has no special legislation governing the rights and responsibilities of landlords and tenants. True, in some countries, this legislation has become too burdensome and excessively interferes with the operation of the market. But for Israel, we think that some minimum ground rules, for instance on notice periods, would help encourage the rental market. I shall now turn to policies relating to business. Clearly, many policy areas affect the environment for business. The macroeconomic, education and social policies that we have talked about so far are clearly important. In addition, there are what you might call more proximate policy influences on business. I find it useful to group them into 3 activities. First, support schemes, such as research grants for innovative companies, targeted support for SMEs, and support for large-scale greenfield investment. Second, you have efforts to improve what I call the interface between government and business. For instance, looking for ways to cut back on red tape. Third, and the part that business doesn't always like, government tries to ensure that markets are competitive. for instance through network industry reform, competition legislation and regulation, and corporate governance. This survey didn't particularly focus on the first of these topics, but issues relating to the second two came up throughout the survey. First, in our housing chapter, we found that there were indeed difficulties in the planning process. We understand that, at least in the past, permit processes and other red tape have taken about 2.5 years from the moment when property development is approved to when construction begins. This clearly ought to be shortened. In light of this, we welcome in principle the proposals for structural reform to planning processes that include some decentralisation in decision making. This said, we warn against overly compromising checks and balances to guard against undesirable conflicts of interest and imbalanced powers between planning authorities, property developers and local populations. The second issue that came up in this survey were competition concerns in the energy sector. Now, the energy sector, along with telecommunications and transport, is a key network industry. As you probably know, many OECD countries have shifted to a model in these sectors, have shifted the business model of these sectors from monopoly state-owned provision to market-based provision. Back in the mid-1990s, reform in the electricity sector looked promising, with the establishment of an independent regulator and a new legal framework. However, since then, progress has been slow. In quite a number of OECD countries, both generation and distribution are now run by the private sector, and choice of provider has been brought to the household level. In contrast, Israel's electricity supply chain remains dominated by the IEC. Approvals for independent private production have been made recently, which implies that at least generation may face some competition. However, there is no sign as yet for reform to the distribution network. Also, our survey drew attention to some concerns in the gas sector. Now, the gas sector was established with a market competition model in mind, but nevertheless, concerns have emerged that the consortium engaged in exploration and development have become too powerful. In this regard, it is unfortunate that at least for the time being, the natural gas imported from Egypt cannot be relied on. Clearly, the competition authorities need to keep a close eye on the consortia operating in the offshore fields. Third, and possibly the largest issue in a sense, or most contemporary issue, is our competition concerns in the financial sector. This survey drew attention to two issues. First, there's been long-standing concern expressed about the degree of competition in retail financial products, with much attention focused on the fees charged in banking. At least according to a Bank of Israel report, competition on this front has been strengthening, which is welcome. In addition, as you all know, there's been renewed attention about the fact that most of Israel's large financial institutions are part of the large business groups, and there is a wide debate about the role and influence of these groups in the Israeli economy. Now, I think one important thing to point out is that influential business groups are not unusual. This well-known research by the Bank of Israel shows that it's supposed to be the 20 largest family and business groups, not 10 as shown there, control about 30% of the stock market. This is similar, for example, to France, Belgium and Portugal. Now, this type of company structure does have pluses. These types of structures can benefit from positive information flows, reduced transactions costs, and advantageous opportunities for financial intermediation. However, such groups can provide opportunity for undesirable exploitation of information by the controlling shareholders. And this is perhaps particularly the case when you have pyramidal type structures, such as the ones you have in Israel. What's our assessment on this issue of the financial sector and company groups? Well, we think that the separation of large financial entities from control by large non-financial entities, plus the other new checks as suggested by the Concentration Committee, are good recommendations. We also think that the committee's recommendations for strengthening minority shareholders' rights are also sound. You may know that the committee has in particular recommended stronger minority shareholder rights where there are companies with a significant gap between control and equity holdings, so-called wedge companies. However, we do note that all of these measures may not solve all of the problems. So, for instance, in Korea, it was found that despite rules, heavy restrictions on the Korean company group's involvement in the banking sector, this did not prevent all the problems in group financing. For instance, in the 1997 Asia crisis, they had huge difficulties with intra-group loan guarantees. So, essentially, the Concentration Committee's measures will have to be watched carefully. As a final point, I think we have to remind ourselves that some of these large business groups' influence may not really only come from these corporate governance issues in their structure. It might be quite simply that they control sectors of the economy that are not competitive, in which case what you should also be doing is very much ensuring that your standard competition, sectoral competition legislation and oversight is sound. Thank you.
Before moving to the discussant, I would like to thank the Drora Berdichev and all the administrative staff for organizing this event. So I would like to ask Dr. Claude Barabi to discuss the policy, the energy and housing policy, please.
Thank you. First, I would like to start by saying that I was asked to review the housing market and the energy sector parts of the report. And as you might know, as people in academia, over time, with all the refereeing process that we are going to and the referee reports that we have to actually submit on an almost daily basis, we get and become quite proficient in finding faults in the works of others. So I must say that in this case, it wasn't an easy task to find those faults, which in my book means that it was actually quite a good report. And yet, there are a few issues that I would like to highlight, in which I think we should put and give some consideration to. But keep in mind, first, that, and I put it in writing so that no one will say that I didn't say it, the report is, in my opinion, a serious and unbiased and professional analysis of the Israeli economy. Actually, it's a very good review for anyone who wants to get a quick overview of and a quick understanding of the Israeli economy. It's also a useful tool intended to serve policymakers and analysts. Now, having said that, let's go to to the remarks. First of all, regarding the housing market, we know that the main problem identified is soaring prices. So let's divide it into two. First, on one hand, we know that for several years the housing constructions had not kept pace with the increase in the demand, basically made by the increase of the number of households. So there was a shortage in supply. On the other hand, at least according to the report, there has been very strong incentives for home ownership. In fact, the report tells us that there has been a general policy of encouraging home ownership, partially based and supported by very low interest rate and other tax exemptions that are unusually generous. Now, if we do take the second part, which means that we are looking mostly at the demand, there is, at least at first hand, a bit of a puzzle. Because if we just remember the last summer, there have been public protests calling for affordable housing. So, on one hand, we are told that we have extremely generous incentives that should allow anyone easily to purchase houses. On the other hand, we have an outcry out there, and the outcry doesn't come from a marginal part of the population. If you remember the demonstrations, we were talking about a serious share of the Israeli population. Maybe unlike other places, the protests in Israel reflected the needs and the desires of a majority of the Israeli population. So, how can it be? Partially, I believe the answer is that those incentives for home ownership didn't differentiate between first residents and those who actually buy houses for investment and foreign owners. We know about the phenomena of empty houses in many cities, in which we have basically foreign owners purchasing houses, putting some pressure on the demand, increasing prices, and obviously they are not part of the protest and the outcry. There are also those who purchased houses because the financial market was not so great and there were no alternatives in terms of investments, and they decided that that's the best place to do some speculations. Now, what has been done since? On one hand, we know, and the work in the survey recognize the fact that efforts have been made to subdue demand. We also know that the authorities have taken special steps to speed up the approval of housing constructions, in other words, to increase the supply. And indeed, the market has cooled off somewhat. This is a quote out of the report. Yet, I don't know if you've noticed, but listening to the presentation, I got the feeling that most of the recommendation was on the demand side, basically scaling back support for home purchases. And that's even though the researchers themselves recognize that demand side will react less to price signals. That's because of the segmentation of the Israeli population, the size of the Israeli market, the fact that housing are concentrated. At the end of the day, there is no serious reason to believe that the panacea is in the demand side more than what was actually already achieved. And I would say look at the supply. But in the meantime, I ask myself, what could be another reason to actually scale back in home ownership? Again, reading the report, I discovered that indeed international experience teaches us that policies that favor home ownership oftentimes have the misintended impact of raising labor mobility issues. The idea is that once you're fixed to an house, you are less likely to move even if there are job opportunities elsewhere. However, again, quoting from the same report, it seems that they do recognize the reality of the Israeli market, which is that Israel is a relatively small in geographic size. Distance between towns and cities is mostly commutable, and job opportunities are fairly concentrated, all of which mean that even if someone sticks to his residence and is unlikely to move, it won't really affect the labor market. So the bottom line, the way I see it, is focus on the supply rather than the demand. The effect of an increased supply, it's basically only a question of time, and potentially already started. The cooling off, in my opinion, is mainly due to the increased supply that we've seen in the market. I do agree totally with the idea that regulations and procedures governing housing construction, replacement, renovation, extensions of existing dwellings should be streamlined, should be eased, and made more transparent. As a matter of fact, I would go even one step further and say push a little bit more on those steps so that we will get a little bit greater injection of new houses in the market and release of second-hand houses in the market as well. What else? Another issue I found interesting to discuss is the idea of a bubble. When you raise the issue of the housing market, typically the first question asked is there a bubble? The answer, I don't know. Yet, the fact that the authors as well do not take a stand there, but put it as a question mark, I believe cause a little bit of a conservative approach in their handling of, for example, the increased supply. Now, what does it mean, a bubble? I mean, obviously, prices are very high. And I do believe that prices will go down. The difference between a typical market in which demand and supply regulate the price and that the price actually reflects the fundamentals of the market, in which case, even though the prices are high, I wouldn't be too concerned because once the supply will increase, the prices will go down. Whereas if you believe that there is a bubble, you believe that the prices are unrealistically high and that at some point it will explode, crash, and in that case, it can actually affect the entire financial system and the banking system, etc. If that's the case, we should be careful. However, for the time being, I would say let the market do its course and see whether or not we do see an easy decline or an abrupt crash, hoping for the first one. Another interesting issue brought up by the researchers, not mentioned earlier, is the fact that despite the increase in the demand for construction worker because of the new houses built, there is no indication that there is or will be a wage increase and in the construction market. And that suggests that we should probably not bow to the industry pressures to cancel the reductions in quotas of foreign workers as they ask all the time. Hopefully, some of the local workers will be able to benefit from increased wages if we don't. Now I'll switch to the energy sector. The energy sector, my review is actually shorter because I have less issues on which I actually disagree. But that's not only me. The report, while it provides an excellent overview, most of its recommendations are in par with the existing government policies. I haven't found something extremely surprising. As a matter of fact, yes, we are told that we need stronger policy commitment on the direction and timeline of reform of the electricity sector. It has been tried for a long time. I've been in some of those meetings. That's not an easy task. We are dealing with a very strong union. We are dealing with the Israeli Electric Company. For those of you who live here, I don't have to say anything more than that. The idea that we might be able to use their current fiscal problems and financial problems and force them into an agreement of basically breaking up and allowing for greater competition is a welcome idea. I don't know if it will succeed, but I think that's something that the Ministry of Finance and others will embrace very quickly. Another issue that comes up in the report is to ensure adequate generation capacity that is indeed very low at present. We are currently at approximately 9% margin between maximum capacity and peak demand, which is very bad. Being not attached to any network, Israel could run into the risk of having blackouts and brownouts if they cannot supply electricity at any time, at any point in time. So we should increase, indeed, production, and there is a plan. The Ministry of National Infrastructure has a plan to increase the generation capacity so that the margin will be something like 50%, and that's in the coming years, coming next 2 years. I believe that we are on the right path, so again, there is nothing to do but accept the recommendation. The third recommendation, I won't get into details, but if I summarize, it says, follow the Sheshinsky Committee recommendation. There's no one here that could agree more than me, and maybe Sheshinsky if he was here. Okay, another issue, the greenhouse gases reduction plan. Israel's, for those of you who are not aware, came up with a plan, and the plan is a good one. I think the authors would agree that the plan is a good one. They suggest that monitoring and target setting set up by that plan should be clearly defined and locked into legislation. Obviously, they got to know the Israeli character. We tend to forget those things that we aimed for once we get closer and if we are not on target. So that's obviously a good suggestion. The other ones are of the same mind, which is we do have green standards, but at the time being, those standards are voluntary. They suggest we make them mandatory. I would agree with that too. One inaccuracy I found. It has been said that, at least for now, until now, there has been no major schemes for energy saving, which imply that there is an ample room for efficiency gains. In other words, it means that there are many low-hanging fruits out there, and that if we will do some of those schemes of energy efficiency, we will be able to save a lot relatively cheaply. Now, the problem with that is that there has been quite a few energy schemes, plans, programs, some of them that I was involved with since 2007, and most of you living here might remember the campaigns of turning off the lights, putting a thermostat on the boiler, using the washing machines at night, changing the lamps from one type to another. All of those were campaigns that were initiated in Israel and that already used, in my opinion, the low-hanging fruits. Now we are already into programs that are much more costly, like replacing refrigerators, replacing air conditionings, etc. So yes, we should do it, but I wouldn't be so much optimistic about how cheaply it can be done. Another issue is that theory tells us that in some cases renewable requires additional subsidization to spur technological development. I agree. However, the current financing structure is such that if you intended in, let's say, putting up a new renewable-based power plant, the banks would ask for something like 20 years experience using that exact technology. Now, for those of you who know a little bit about renewables, you know that improvements are something of the last few years. And using a 20 years old technology in photovoltaic panels, for example, would mean just using wasteful technology. That won't spur technological development. So, in other words, I would say don't only put additional subsidization, but actually give, for example, some government backing for loans needed in order to come up with new power plants based on renewables. Finally, one of the recommendations that you've just heard is to create an independently managed sovereign wealth fund. Those kinds of wealth funds, and I'm now talking about the proceeds that would come from the natural gas discoveries. Those kinds of funds exist in many, many countries, about 50 countries. However, unlike many countries, I believe that the gains of this kind of fund should be reserved for catastrophic risks, for example, like the ones that we would face if we had some kind of a natural disaster, a war, or an economic crisis. The idea of using annual returns that equate to the internal rate of return, which means that basically every year you take the interest and you leave the fund basically intact so that it will be used for perpetually, is a good one, but I think that some thinking should be made as to how we could actually use the fund dually also for those kind of issues. Energy transportation, another subject. Only 2 more slides, I promise. I was pleased to discover that the authors of the survey suggest that it makes more sense to target car use. What it means is that we should actually see a reduction in the basic rate of purchasing a car. Right now, taxes are high when you purchase a car. However, if you think about it, pollution and other externalities caused by transportation use are not caused by the fact that you bought the car. It's actually better correlated with how much you are actually using your car. If I buy a car and I leave it in my parking lot, I'm not causing much damage to the environment. However, if I'm driving it every day non-stop, then my damage is actually quite significant. Along those lines, we should preferably use measures such as road pricing, congestion charges, or taxes on fuels rather than on the purchase of cars. Another issue was already brought up is the use of company cars. Now I can say that freely. Luckily at the university they don't give us those kind of privileges. But indeed, in companies in which you get a car, even though now the car is actually subtracted from your wage, the marginal use of the car is basically zero. It doesn't cost you anything. And that's an incentive to use the car way more than would be otherwise. The solution that could be used is something similar to what's done with the use of cellular mobile telephones, in which you have some kind of a maximum usage that is indeed tax deducted, but the remaining is not. And as I promised, the final slide is about basically the poor coordination of urban transport, public transport modes. If you think about it, how many times you said, I'll take my car and not use the bus, because the bus brings you nowhere. It brings you to a station in which you cannot really continue your commute. However, if your bus was connected such that the endpoint was next to a railroad, and the endpoint of the railroad was next to a light road, and maybe next to a subway entry, like in many other places in the world, you wouldn't need to use your personal car. As it is right now, all of those are completely disconnected, and which makes it less than efficient. A solution could be to create a regional transport authority. I won't take the credit for that. That's the authors again. Such an authority could, in its planning, make the coordination needed so that the modes of transportation, of public transportation, do connect with each other and increase welfare and reduce car use, private car use. Thank you.
The next discussant is Dr. Sharon Gilad from the school. I asked Sharon to discuss the financial regulation policy, please.
Taking your chair. Just look for my slides. I'll find them. Can you help me with that? Do you know which one is it?
You've done all the way back.
So I'm not sure which one. Yeah, that's right. Fair enough. Only 2 slides, by the way. So first of all, I wanted to thank you for the privilege of reading your report, which I found extremely interesting. I learned a lot from it. I'm not an economist, and therefore I'm going to divide I'm a political scientist, so I'm going to divide my comments into 2. First of all, I want to say something broad from a political science perspective on what is your report doing? What can it do for us? And second, I want to say from a public administration perspective, something about a few comments on your recommendations regarding the overall structure of financial regulation, especially so about what you say, but also about what I think you don't say, what I would like you to have said. So kind of more generally. So from a political science perspective, what can this report do? Well, it cannot do anything unless there are internal participants who will be inclined or disinclined to use your report in internal politics. And in this case, I think the potential impact of this report has to be understood, has to be interpreted and understood in light of the recent social protests and the debate specifically around the Trachtenberg Committee recommendations. So in what sense is this providing pro-change actors some ammunition to ask for a better Israel, so to speak? So, well, I think this report and really all your reports do provide some comparative information which are extremely important for us. It tells us not for the first time that we have very high and steady rising poverty rates, that our students are doing relatively badly in comparison to the rest of the OECD, and that there are very big differences in achievement across social groups. You also tell us something about the causes of these inequalities. So you tell us something about the cutback in government spending for a number of years now, both in terms of spending and in terms of revenue. You show us that we have very low levels of government non-defense spending when compared to the rest of the OECD. And you show us, I think very, very importantly, that we have very limited basic income support and social security provision via the National Security Institute, Habituach HaLeumi. And consequently, well, I think you recommend, if I understand, expansion of state-subsidized and state-free education along the Trachtenberg Committee recommendations. I mean, that's not one of your main points, but I think you do seem to support that, budget considered. And you definitely support increase in basic social security and income protection via the National Insurance Institute, and more extensive use of tax credits for those on low incomes and for working mothers on low incomes in particular. So in all this sense, you do provide, I think, some ammunition for pro-change actors. But I think that on the whole, this report, one can say, the way I interpret it, is that it, at this very moment, given the time that it was given, is that it legitimizes the government resistance for deeper change. And I think in 2 ways. One, it has to do with the way that you interpret and the way you frame the recent social protest. And I think the way you frame it is that these social protests were strictly about price levels. And therefore, because they were about price levels, they really have to do with the fact that we need more competition. But I think, at least within this room and other rooms, there are very different interpretations about what the protest was about. And I think others would say that this has to do with public preferences for a very different capitalism, we want a more social, a universal, some of us at least, you could say want a more social democratic model of capitalism as opposed to the Anglo-American limited, means-tested neoliberal model. So that's one. I think it's about the framing, the way you, so if I take your framing, it's about middle class's concerns have surfaced in the form of recent tent protests with complaints about the cost of housing and price levels. These concerns are linked to the debate about level of competition. And I think you can frame it, and some people have framed it in very different ways. So that's one thing. And I think more explicitly, well, in a very explicit way, you take a stand in the debate between the Treasury, the Tractamen recommendations, and the leaders of the social protest, and many academics who supported them in saying that the government should resist any demand to, so essentially you say, well, you should stay within the current level of spending and was in terms of the ceiling for spending and the ceiling for tax revenue. So you say, despite pressures arising from the red protest, there are welcome indications that the authorities intend to maintain the spending and debt ceiling and are, for instance, investigating channels for economies in the defense budget to create room for additional spending in the social sphere. Now, I want to be very, very clear. As I said, I'm a political scientist, and I have no professional authority to say anything about the merits of the debate, right, in the sense of, should we have a more universal welfare state provision? Should we have higher levels of taxes overall that would allow us to do this? But I'm asking myself, why is the very, very progressive body such as the OECD will choose to take such a clear stand on this debate? And one can think why, but I'm not sure you had to take such a clear position on the debate. That's one. Now going to the thing that I was asked to do, which is say something about financial regulation. Fair enough. So, and I'm going to do this from a very public administration perspective. So not about, you write about so many things, and most of them I don't understand. I mean, I do understand what you write, but I don't think I have anything important to say about them. But from a public administration perspective, I think that I do. So the way I understand, if I understand your recommendation, I think it's quite clearly, you say that we need to restructure the capital markets insurance and savings division, and that it would be a good thing if it would be an independent and separate agency. And that the main argument that you give for this is that there is a risk for political intervention. But you add to that though the Bank of Israel has frequently argued that it should take over the division, this is only one option. But you don't really discuss the pros and cons of the options of the division being placed within the Bank of Israel. So one, I agree with you totally that the Treasury is not a good place, or I don't know if not a good place, it's not the ideal place, let's put it that way, for the division. Not necessarily because of the risk of politicization, but also because the Treasury just has too many burning things to worry about. They have too many agendas to deal with. And therefore, they're not a classic body to put a regulator in. You want a place that would be very focused on regulation. And then the question to my mind is, how can we structure financial regulation in order to facilitate expertise, learning, focused attention, and independence vis-a-vis industry, not just vis-a-vis ministers? So one possibility is your possibility, if I understood it, which is that we need to create I don't know if but it would be advisable if we create an independent capital insurance and savings regulator outside the Treasury, but not necessarily within the Bank of Israel. And I think a strong argument for such a structure, which is the division becomes an independent agency which deals with all the things that division currently deal with, is that Israel has created, quite forcefully, a very segregated financial market. So it's been forcefully segregated so that banks do banking, insurers do insurance, and they also now do long-term savings and so forth. And given that segregated market that was forcefully created on the market, you could say that it makes sense to have a segregated regulatory bodies that essentially mirror the market. And the main advantage of that is then each firm has just one sectorial regulator to deal with. Banks deal with a banking supervisor, insurers deal with the division, which is now an independent agency. And I can see the logic of that. But nonetheless, I think that there's a much better structure that we can think about. And I think the better structure is one that, you don't say it's not a good idea, only you're quite silent about this. And I think a better structure is one that divides regulatory powers according to objectives, meaning micro and macro prudential regulation is one agency, and conduct of business on what we here call We tend to call this consumer protection regulation, even though everything is consumer protection regulation, but that's how we call it. So stability in one agency, consumer protection or conduct of business in another one, and then the second question is, where is it going to be situated? And I think if we were to have an integrated prudential or stability regulator, then I think we should situate it within the Bank of Israel. And why? Because I think if we situated the prudential, both micro and macro, within the Bank of Israel, this would give this regulator access to the Bank of Israel already existing very good research capacities. It would also benefit from the fact that the supervisor of bank already has a very robust reputation worldwide, I think, for prudential regulation as a stability regulator. It is also the case that the Bank of Israel, the supervisor of bank, has a relatively low staff turnover. And as a result of that, it has quite an ample expertise. And this would have other benefits. It's true that the supervisor of banks and the division deal with different firms. That's true. But that's actually, there's a great benefit and advantage there for learning between those dealing with insurance and savings and those dealing with banks. And I think this learning is more likely to happen if you situate it all within the Bank of Israel. In addition to that, if one day we turn to have a crisis, which we almost had, not in banking, but in other parts of the financial sector, right, such as pensions and long-term savings instruments, then it would be a good thing for those regulators to be situated within the Bank of Israel, which facilitate Bank of Israel rescue of non-banking financial institutions. And finally, I think, given that you're very concerned about coordinated scrutiny of macroprudential risks that arise from to both banks and institutional investors from major conglomerates, then I think it will make sense to have an integrated micro and macroprudential regulator, and I think it would be best situated within the Bank of Israel. So that's one. At the same time, I think, for quite similar reasons, that it would make absolute sense for us to have an integrated financial business conduct consumer protection agency outside the Bank of Israel. Why? Well, one, as recently noted by the Trachtenberg Committee, but they're not the first one to do this, when facing two objectives, stability and consumer protection, regulators tend to focus on one objective over another. So I think, so if a financial regulator that focuses on financial stability may be relatively lenient with regard to banks' level of fees and with regard to pension providers' management fees. So does moving consumer protection regulation outside the Bank of Israel and integrating it with similar functions within the division, I think will result in more consistent and more focused attention to these type of issues. Such agency could be independent, or maybe we'd want to situate it within the Israeli Security Authority, which is in charge of overall similar type of tasks with regard to the protection of the public as investors in public companies. Now, this issue of consumer protection further brings me to your assessment of the progress made in retail financial regulation. So you say, and I basically agree, that the Bank of Israel greater transparency to fees as opposed to direct regulation of the level of fees is theoretically sound. I think it is theoretically sound. But if we look carefully, and you also said that this seems to have been a successful policy. I think that if we scrutinize and we look much more carefully at the reports of the Bank of Israel, what we tend to find is actually slightly more complicated. What we find is that the Bank of Israel tells us that in real terms, the revenue, or in real terms, the average fees have been reduced. But we do know at the same time that the tariffs, that the uniform tariffs have not been reduced. So what does this tell us? All that this tells us is that the banks were willing to give concessions to certain groups, right? But they were not willing, they did not reduce their level of fees overall. They were willing to give concessions to certain type of groups. We also know they've done it in a way which is fairly opaque. It's very hard for us to know who receives those concessions and who does not receive them. And in addition to that, if we look at Israeli Statistics Bureau statistics, we find something very, very strange. We find that about 6 months before these reforms started, the tariffs just went way up, so they just shot up just before the reform started. And then actually they stayed quite the same. So in terms of the tariffs, you know, they're fairly stable ever since. So why am I going into this? I mean, it doesn't matter that much, right? But I think that if we were to have a dedicated consumer protection integrated agency, then it would have been much more critical of the bank's implementation and response to the so-called fee reform and to similar type of reforms. And I think it would be good for us to have this type of integrated consumer protection agency. Finally, with regard to your recommendation that the government should create a permanent unit that will monitor non-competitive behavior and macro-prudential risks that arise from the operation of major conglomerates. I'm not absolutely sure that this, I mean, I'm not sure if I understand the recommendation, but it would seem to me, all other things being equal, that again, if we're worried about regulatory focus, and we know that regulators are focused on specific mandates, and it doesn't help them to have few mandates at the same time, then I think all other things being equal, it would make more sense to say, well, if we're worried about conglomerates, then we should give more powers to the antitrust authority to deal with the competitive issues, and equally, the macro and micro-prudential issues that arise from conglomerates should be dealt with by the integrated prudential regulator, which I say should be within the Bank of Israel. And I think if we were to create a new agency, well, what would that mean? That would mean that this agency will come to compete and undermine our current institution, and I don't think that's helpful. Thank you very, very much.
I'll respond very briefly. I mean, I don't know. I must say those were particularly good discussions, and I thank both Claude and Sharon for giving obviously hard thought to the work we've presented, and giving a little bit of a feeling that there's a lot of detail behind this, not just what you heard us in 40 minutes present you. Let me just take 2 points, one each, that I want. I don't disagree with anything you said, basically, but I just sometimes you presented perhaps a little one-sided view of what we actually did, or you may be advocating something that we're a little bit worried about another argument. On Claude's part about the housing, where he said there were more points where he diverged a little bit from what we said, and he sort of tried to say that we advocated more working on the demand side to dealing with the problems in the housing market, whereas he prefers to deal on the supply side. I'm not sure we really would subscribe to that depiction of our views. We definitely feel that getting the unblocking the supply of land through the land administration has been a great success policy-wise, and almost certainly either prevented a bubble or at least prevented it from getting even worse, and that's clear to, I think, both Phil and myself and our colleagues. On the other hand, I think why the demand side policies that are there now are problematic is because all the incentives to ownership, as you said, that are there have shown themselves, and Phil was perhaps pulling his punches a little bit in his presentation, not only in Israel, but everywhere. When you give demand-side incentives, it goes into the prices. It gets embodied in the price level. And so you say you want to help people buy their own houses, and you put tax credits or whatever it is into effect. And does it actually allow more people to buy their own houses? Almost certainly not. So it's a law of unintended consequences. The result is it gets into the prices get higher, and at best you're left neutral, but maybe even worse because it takes that much longer to gather the down payment, which regulators have established usually at 30% or whatever as a minimum, and it certainly doesn't help if you come from a less affluent background where that is the main constraint. You have to get over that before you can get in onto the housing ladder. So that's why we don't particularly like the the current policies on the demand side, and where we would advocate changing them. But we agree with you that supply is what is going to cause the quantitative adjustment. On Sharon's points, again, I think, in fact, you've convinced me. I think on the latter thing, I think after giving it further thought, personally, but I don't know if you've convinced Phil. He may have some different views. But I would want to say one thing when you said your preamble on the tent protests and the more sociological or political economy types of arguments. I guess one of the reasons why we come down so strongly on saying we don't think that our takeaway from the tent protests is not, okay, we're willing to give up on or to see the Israeli government give up on the medium-term objective of bringing debt down, is that what we've witnessed essentially over the last year or so in peripheral European countries. If we hadn't seen the viciousness with which what used to be called the bond market vigilantes, with which financial markets have taken objection to financial sectors that looked a little iffy. I mean, some of them are a lot more iffy than Israel's ever likely to be. But if you recognize the fact that debt levels are now, government debt levels are now coming under intense scrutiny, we feel that if you had a situation where either the Trachtenberg Committee had recommended a lot more and said, okay, run higher deficits, abandon for the time being the 60% debt target, and stuff like that, I fear that the shekel today at 377 or whatever, you'd be looking at 4 something, and the Bank of Israel, instead of doing, as we hope it will do, cutting interest rates in the coming few months, would be looking at saying, what do? We have to intervene, dump our reserves, probably raise our interest rates and stuff too. So that's why we felt that we did have to say that. But I don't think it's fair to say that we're saying the tent protesters shouldn't be listened to or anything like that. As I tried to make clear in the fiscal part of my presentation, if you feel that you cannot get out of the rest, because there are highly valid arguments for spending more money on education and various forms of welfare, things to deal with some of the tent protesters' demands. Other ones are to do more with price level, as you said. If you can't get it out of the existing budget, then you have to raise taxes. And then we say, well, that's fine, but be careful how you do it, because raising some taxes are going to cost you a lot in terms of competitiveness. They're going to cause the mobile capital that flows between West Europe and the United States and Israel in the form of startup capital and things like that. They're going to say, hey, Israel's going the wrong way. Those guys, they don't care about, or not to the same extent, about looking after the tent protesters' demands. And so you have to be careful on what kinds of tax bases you tax. And perhaps that'll lead me back to the final thing. We're coming back to Claude's thing on the energy sector, is that one thing that he didn't say, and I don't know, maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it, is that a lot of the problems sort of go away on the greenhouse gas side if you have a carbon tax. And I think that then you don't have to necessarily, I mean, in the relevant sectors, you don't have to worry about renewables and things like that, how you exactly structure your support for them if they're properly taxed through a carbon tax thing. So green taxation, we think, could be still used quite a bit more to generate some more revenues. And it's not popular to say it, but we think that VAT is a good tax base, and you're at 16 now. There's a lot of countries that are at 25. We don't think that you need to go to 25. You'd be, but 1 or 2 more points would generate a lot of means to help deal with the tent protesters' demands and more general demands. If you decide politically that you need to get more revenue. Thank you.
Just very quickly, yeah, just to follow up on what Peter was just saying, I guess with regard to how what we say might be viewed by some people with regard to the tent protests, I guess, yeah, we seem to say some things that are not in line with what many of these people are saying. But I think it's partly that they although well intended, some of the ideas are just not wouldn't end up as a particularly efficient means of achieving their goals. So, for instance, some are proposing much bigger exemptions on VAT, seeing that as a way of lowering living costs for households. But what you're doing by doing that is you're actually implicitly giving money to absolutely everybody, including those who are perfectly well off. So, I mean, our argument would be, well, be more focused and use tools like the earned income tax credit for the unemployed, do things like increase standard welfare support, use the regular tools that are there, rather than doing this rather more indirect measures, such as through VAT. As regards, just one point on the supply side with housing, I mean, perhaps one thing that maybe wasn't stressed all that much in the report, I don't know, was what was striking in Israel is the extent to which the planning authorities steer the volume of housing that is constructed. And it appears they're able to do this by effectively offering on a regular basis properties for development, and they're very specific about this. They say 200 apartment dwelling in plot so and so, and it's somewhat unusual in that I've always had the impression that it's having much more steerage on supply than possibly in markets elsewhere. Sure, you'll need planning regulation and so on, but the ideal situation is that the planning agency has all sorts of development land out there that property developers can pick up on. But at any one moment in time, it's not actually the constraint on the supply. I think what could happen now that the property market is turning down is it doesn't really matter how much Mr. Atias puts on the market for property development. The property developers may simply look at it and say, well, we might buy it up, but we're going to take our time in building it, and so on and so forth. So, in fact, what may happen is that, in fact, the pace of building may indeed slow down, and it'll be at the initiative of the property developers and not perhaps what the authorities would like. I mean, as a broad principle, it's better if your planning authority is not steering to such a tight degree the volume of construction in the economy. And you might have avoided this period of effectively what seems to be undersupply for several years if you hadn't had that situation. So.
Unfortunately, we are already over time, so we will not take questions. So I would like to thank Dr. Peter Jarrett, Dr. Philip Hemmings, Dr. Claude Barabee, and Dr. Sharon Gilad. Thank you all.